Throughout history, great empires do not collapse because of lost wars, invading barbarians, or nuclear winters. They collapse when their currency is rejected. The end of a superpower isn't marked by an explosion, but by a ledger entry that nobody trusts anymore. On February 26, 2022, the United States and the European Union made a decision that they believed was a masterstroke. They disconnected Russia from SWIFT, the central nervous system of global finance. In Washington and Brussels, this was celebrated as the financial nuclear option, a move designed to vaporize the Russian economy overnight. But they were wrong. What looked like a checkmate was actually a suicide note for the global financial order. By freezing $300 billion in sovereign reserves and weaponizing the banking system, the West didn't just target Moscow. They unwittingly sent a terrifying signal to every other nation on Earth. Your money is yours only as long as Washington agrees with your politics. This is not a video about the war in Ukraine. This is a forensic autopsy of the US dollar's dominance. We are witnessing a specific historical mechanism that has triggered exactly 4 times in the last 110 years. From Britain in 1914 to the US in 1979, every time a hegemon weaponizes its financial network, it accelerates its own demise. We are now entering stage 5 of this decay cycle. The data shows the timeline has already started, and the clock is ticking faster than anyone on Wall Street is willing to admit. If you believe your capital is safe simply because it sits in a too-big-to-fail bank in New York or London, the historical patterns you are about to see suggest you are looking at the wrong map. The system isn't just breaking, it is being replaced. To understand why the global order is fracturing, we must first strip away the marketing of the current system. For decades, the financial world has operated under a single, comforting lie that the infrastructure of global money is neutral. We are told that banks are just utilities, like water pipes or electric lines, indifferent to who uses them. This is a fabrication. The plumbing of the global economy is not a public utility. It is a privately owned panopticon. And at the center of this surveillance architecture sits an acronym that most people ignore until it is weaponized: SWIFT. SWIFT, or the Society for Worldwide Interbank Financial Telecommunication, is widely misunderstood. It is not a bank, it does not hold your deposits, and it does not transfer actual money. SWIFT is a messaging system. It is the WhatsApp of high finance, a secure network that connects over 11,000 banking institutions in nearly 200 countries. When a bank in New York wants to send $1 million to a bank in Tokyo, SWIFT sends the encrypted message that validates the transaction. Without this message, the money does not move. The vault stays locked. Established in 1973 by 239 banks to replace the slow, error-prone telex machines of the mid-20th century, SWIFT was sold to the world as a technocratic upgrade, a standardized, efficient way to facilitate global trade. Crucially, it was headquartered in Brussels, Belgium. This location was a strategic choice, designed to project an image of European neutrality, independent of Cold War politics. But neutrality on paper is meaningless when faced with the reality of corporate governance. While SWIFT claims independence, its board of directors has always been dominated by executives from US and Western European banks. The system was built by the West, for the West, and as we would eventually discover, it obeys the West. But SWIFT is only half of the trap. The second component is the currency itself. This is the mechanism of the dollar leash. The vast majority of international trade, whether it's Saudi oil, Brazilian coffee, or Chinese electronics, is invoked in US dollars. Here's the technical nuance that gives Washington its superpower. US dollars cannot technically exist outside of the US banking system. When money moves internationally, it must clear through correspondent banks located in New York. If a French bank sends dollars to a German bank, that digital signal must touch American soil to be verified. The moment that transaction touches a New York server, it falls under US legal jurisdiction. This creates a choke point of absolute control. The United States government does not need to own SWIFT to weaponize it. It simply needs to pressure the correspondent banks, or leverage its legal dominance over the dollar clearing system. With a single phone call or executive order, Washington can force SWIFT to revoke a nation's access codes. Once disconnected, the country is effectively deleted from the global economy. No trade finance, no cross-border payments, no ability to pay for imports or receive money for exports. It is financial asphyxiation. We know this works because we have seen the beta test. In 2012, the Obama administration decided to use this architecture to bring Iran to its knees. They pressured SWIFT to disconnect Iranian banks. The results were immediate and devastating. It wasn't that Iran ran out of oil. It was that no one could pay them for it. The Iranian economy contracted by 9% almost overnight. Inflation skyrocketed to 45% as the local currency collapsed. The country was paralyzed, not by bombs, but by code. This pressure eventually forced Tehran to the negotiating table for the 2015 nuclear deal. For Western policymakers, the lesson of 2012 was intoxicating. They had discovered a clean way to wage war. They believed they possessed the ultimate non-kinetic weapon, a kill switch for rogue nations. This success bred a dangerous complacency. The West convinced itself that this leverage was permanent. They believed that because they controlled the pipes, they owned the water. They assumed that if they ever used this weapon against a larger target, say a nuclear-armed superpower with a $1.7 trillion economy, the result would be exactly the same. They believed the victim would have no choice but to submit. They did not consider that the victim might simply build a new set of pipes. The illusion of neutrality was shattered in 2012, but the illusion of invincibility remained intact. Until February 2022, the weapon had been tested on a small scale and it worked perfectly. But history warns that scaling up a financial attack often triggers a mechanism that the attacker cannot control. To the untrained eye, geopolitical chaos looks random. But when you overlay the data on a timeline, a distinct, repetitive architecture emerges. We are not witnessing a new phenomenon. We are watching a known historical algorithm execute its code for the fourth time in a century. The weaponization of finance always follows the same five-stage decay cycle. And every single time, the dominant power believes they are immune to the consequences. To see where the dollar is going, we must look at where the British pound went. In 1914, the British pound sterling was the global reserve currency, and the UK controlled approximately 65% of international reserves. It was a position of dominance that rivals the United States today. But when World War I began, in August 1914, Britain made a fatal strategic calculation. They passed the Trading with the Enemy Act. For the first time in the modern era, London decided to confiscate the private assets of German individuals and businesses held in British banks. Before this moment, finance was considered separate from war. Armies fought on the battlefield, but bank contracts were sacred. Britain broke that seal. While this devastated German commerce in the short term, the long-term damage to Britain was far worse. Neutral countries watched closely. They realized a terrifying truth. If London could seize German money, they could seize any money. The trust was broken. Neutral nations immediately began diversifying their reserves, moving capital from London to a rising neutral financial hub across the Atlantic, New York. By 1920, the US held more gold reserves than Britain. By 1944, the dollar had officially replaced the pound. The weaponization of 1914 started a clock that ran for exactly 30 years until the empire's financial death. The cycle repeated in 1979. Following the Iranian Revolution and the hostage crisis, President Jimmy Carter invoked the International Emergency Economic Powers Act to freeze $12 billion in Iranian assets held in U.S. banks. The message sent to the global south was unmistakable. Sovereign immunity is a myth. Your national savings are not yours. They are merely permitted to exist by the U.S. president. This triggered the second great migration of capital. The OPEC nations, despite being U.S. allies, quietly began to hedge their bets. They reduced their dollar holdings from 85% in 1977 down to 71% by 1991. They moved funds to Zurich, London, and Tokyo. It wasn't an immediate exodus, but it was a structural shift. The foundation of the dollar's monopoly had developed its first hairline fracture. But the most critical error, the one that set the stage for our current crisis, occurred in 2014. When Russia annexed Crimea, the United States responded with targeted sanctions. Crucially, however, they did not cut Russia off from SWIFT. The Obama administration applied just enough pressure to anger Moscow, but not enough to cripple it. In the world of virology, if you give a patient a weak dose of a virus, you don't kill them. You inoculate them. You teach their immune system how to survive. That is exactly what the U.S. did to the Russian financial system. For 8 years, between 2014 and 2022, Russia prepared for total economic war. They understood that the dollar was no longer a safe store of value, but a geopolitical weapon. And the data proves this preparation was methodical. Russia dumped its holdings of U.S. Treasury bonds, slashing them from $130 billion in 2013 to a negligible $2 billion by 2020. They aggressively bought gold. They built their own domestic payment system, the SPF, to ensure internal transactions would continue if the external lines were cut. They signed agreements with China to trade in yuan. Western analysts dismissed these moves as paranoia or posturing. They believed the Russian economy was too integrated with the West to ever truly decouple. They were wrong. By being half aggressive in 2014, Washington unknowingly trained its adversary to survive the ultimate weapon. They gave Russia the most valuable asset in any conflict, time. So when the hammer finally fell in 2022, the target was no longer soft. The U.S. was not striking a surprised victim. They were striking a hardened bunker. The stage was set for the breakpoint. The weapon that was supposed to end the war would instead break the system itself. History tells us that you can only use a financial nuclear weapon once. In February 2022, the U.S. decided to push the button, and the explosion didn't go where they expected. On February 26, 2022, the United States and the European Union crossed the Rubicon. They announced the expulsion of major Russian banks from SWIFT and, far more significantly, froze approximately $300 billion of the Central Bank of Russia's foreign reserves held in Western jurisdictions. This was the nuclear option. It was the ultimate test of the theory that financial hegemony is equal to military dominance. The architects of this policy, in Washington and Brussels, were operating on a specific set of assumptions. They believed that by severing the digital arteries of the world's 11th largest economy, they would induce immediate cardiac arrest. The playbook predicted that the ruble would turn to dust, hyperinflation would tear the social fabric apart, and the Russian economy would implode from the inside. The expectation was clear. Putin would either be forced to withdraw his tanks or face a revolution born of poverty. For the first 48 hours, the simulation appeared to be correct. The shock was visceral. The ruble lost nearly 30% of its value in 2 days. The Moscow stock market was forced to close to prevent a complete wipeout. Long lines formed at ATMs across Russia as citizens panicked, desperate to withdraw cash before the system went dark. Western media outlets declared a decisive economic victory. They wrote obituaries for the Russian economy, confident that no nation could survive excommunication from the dollar system. But then the chaos stopped. What the West failed to anticipate was that Russia's financial technocrats had spent the previous 8 years wargaming exactly this scenario. Instead of collapsing, the Russian central bank executed a brutal, precise counteroffensive. They immediately hiked interest rates to 20%, instantly making it profitable to hold rubles again and arresting the currency's freefall. Then came the geopolitical judo move. Moscow demanded that unfriendly nations in Europe pay for their natural gas, not in euros or dollars, but in rubles. This created an artificial, mandatory demand for the Russian currency. If Europe wanted to keep its lights on, it had to prop up the very currency it was trying to destroy. The recovery was mathematically impossible according to Western models, yet it happened. Within just 3 months, the ruble had not only stabilized but recovered all of its pre-sanction value. By the end of 2022, the economy had stabilized. By 2023, the Russian economy grew by 3.6%, a rate faster than the G7 economies of Germany and the UK, the very nations leading the sanctions regime. This was a humiliating revelation for the US Treasury. It proved a dangerous theorem. A major resource-rich economy can be cut off from SWIFT, stripped of its dollar reserves and isolated by the West, and it can still function. The illusion of the kill switch was broken. How did they do it? They didn't fix the old pipes. They simply routed the water through new ones. The trade did not stop. It just went dark to Western surveillance. Russian oil and gas, previously sold to Europe in dollars, flowed east to China and India. The payment rails shifted from SWIFT to Chinese CIPS and Russia's own SPFS. The composition of Russian trade underwent a radical transformation. In 2021, 87% of Russian trade was settled in dollars or euros. By 2024, that number had collapsed to just 60%. The remaining 40% was now being settled in yuan, rubles, rupees, and dirhams. Russia and China effectively created a closed-loop system. Bilateral trade surged to $240 billion in 2023, almost entirely settled in their own currencies, bypassing the US banking system completely. With India, Russia accepted rupees for oil. In other sectors, settlements moved to gold or even barter arrangements. The US had intended to isolate Russia. Instead, they inadvertently accelerated the creation of a shadow financial infrastructure. The SWIFT weapon worked tactically. It caused pain and disruption, but it failed strategically. It did not stop the war, and it did not collapse the regime. Worse, it revealed the limits of American power. The entire world watched as the unbeatable weapon was fired, and the target remained standing. The fear of being cut off from the dollar was replaced by the realization that life exists after the dollar. The psychological barrier was breached, and once the fear of a weapon is gone, the power of the empire that wields it begins to evaporate. The spell was broken. But while Russia was the target, the real damage wasn't done in Moscow. It was done in the capitals of neutral nations who watched the strike and realized they were next. The real damage of February 2022 was not inflicted on the Russian economy. It was inflicted on the psychology of the global South. For decades, nations like Saudi Arabia, Brazil, India, and China operated under the assumption that the dollar was a neutral store of value. That assumption evaporated the moment the US Treasury froze sovereign assets. In capitals from Riyadh to Beijing, the calculation changed overnight. If you were the leader of a non-Western nation, you were now forced to ask a terrifying question. Today, we are not in conflict with Washington. But what if tomorrow there is a disagreement over Taiwan, over Kashmir, over energy production quotas? If the US can freeze $300 billion of a nuclear superpower's money with a single executive order, your reserves are not safe. This realization triggered the panic of the neutrals. We are witnessing a historic hedging event where nations are not necessarily anti-American, but they are terrified of American leverage. They are liquidating their exposure to US political risk. The data is undeniable. China, the largest holder of US debt, has been aggressively dumping US treasuries. From a peak of $1.3 trillion in 2013, their holdings have collapsed to approximately $775 billion in 2024. Where is that capital going? It is moving into the only asset that has no counterparty risk and cannot be frozen by a sanctions decree: gold. For 3 consecutive years, 2022, 2023, and 2024, global central banks have purchased over 1,000 tons of gold annually. This is the highest sustained level of accumulation since the 1970s, just before the collapse of the Bretton Woods system. The buyers are not just America's rivals like Russia and China, but also neutral players like Singapore, Poland, and India. They are physically removing their wealth from the digital ledger controlled by New York. As the capital leaves, the infrastructure to bypass the dollar is being laid at breakneck speed. The most sophisticated alternative is China's CIPS, the cross-border interbank payment system. For years, Western analysts dismissed CIP as a minor experiment. They are not laughing anymore. In 2023, CIPS processed approximately $27 trillion in transactions, a figure that has more than doubled in just 3 years. It is rapidly evolving into a shadow SWIFT, a parallel network connecting over 1,400 financial institutions in 110 countries. This system allows nations to settle trade directly in UN, completely bypassing the US banking system and its sanctions regime. The result is a statistical collapse in dollar dominance that the mainstream media largely ignores. In 1999, the dollar accounted for 71% of global reserves. By 2024, that figure had crashed to 58%. But the terrifying metric is the velocity of this decline. The dollar lost more market share in the last 2 years than it did in the previous 2 decades combined. The final pillar of American financial hegemony, the petrodollar, has also been fractured. For 50 years, an unwritten deal ensured that oil was sold exclusively in dollars, creating artificial demand for the US currency. That monopoly is over. In 2023, Saudi Arabia quietly began accepting yuan for oil exports to China. The UAE is settling trade with India in rupees and dirhams. This brings us to the American trap. The United States has enjoyed an exorbitant privilege for decades, the ability to print money to pay for imports and fund massive deficits because the world had to hold dollars. The US effectively exported its inflation to the rest of the world. But as the world moves away from the dollar, that privilege turns into a prison. When foreign nations stop buying US treasuries to fund their reserves, demand for US debt collapses. To attract buyers, the US Treasury must offer higher interest rates. This increases the cost of borrowing for the US government, which is already $34 trillion in debt. If the world rejects the dollar, the trillions of dollars currently held overseas will eventually flood back into the US domestic economy. This reversal means the US will no longer be able to export its inflation. It will have to eat it. Washington is now caught in a trap of its own making. By weaponizing the dollar to punish Russia, they have incentivized the world to stop using the dollar. As demand falls, the ability of the US government to run unlimited deficits without consequence disappears. The era of easy money is ending. The US will soon face a stark choice that it hasn't had to make since the Great Depression. Impose brutal austerity to balance the budget, or print money into a domestic hyperinflationary spiral. The trap is snapped shut on the national level. But for the individual American citizen, the consequences are just beginning to manifest at the grocery store and the gas pump. We have established the crime scene, the motive, and the weapon. Now we must look at the clock. If we accept that the weaponization of SWIFT in 2022 triggered the final stage of the dollar's decay, the most critical question remaining is not if the dollar will lose its crown, but when. To answer this, we must return to the British model. When London weaponized the pound against Germany in 1914, it took exactly 30 years for the pound to be officially dethroned at the Bretton Woods Conference in 1944. 3 decades of slow, grinding decline before the final handover. If we overlay that 30-year template onto the American timeline, starting from the SWIFT sanctions of 2022, it places the end of dollar hegemony around the year 2052. However, relying on that date would be a fatal error. We do not live in the analog world of 1914, where transactions were settled by steamships carrying gold bars, or telegraph messages that took hours to verify. We live in the age of digital velocity. Technology acts as a massive accelerant. The adoption of new payment rails like China's KIPS or blockchain-based settlements scales exponentially, not linearly. In the digital age, infrastructure that used to take decades to build can be deployed in years. SIP's transaction volume doubled in just 3 years. Therefore, we must adjust the timeline. The network effect of de-dollarization will likely cut the historical 30-year cycle in half. Based on the current velocity of central bank gold purchases and the rapid expansion of BRICS, a realistic timeframe for the dollar to lose its reserve status is between 15 to 25 years from the 2022 trigger point. That puts the event horizon somewhere between 2037 and 2047. This does not mean the world ends in 2037. It means the world changes. And for the average American citizen, this shift will be felt not as a sudden crash, but as a permanent reduction in your quality of life. Welcome to the new normal. For the last 80 years, Americans have lived in a financial anomaly. Because the world needed dollars to trade, there was always artificial demand for the currency in your pocket. This kept the value of the dollar artificially high, allowing Americans to consume cheap goods from abroad. You could import electronics from China, cars from Japan, and oil from the Middle East for pennies on the dollar, simply because you held the world's reserve currency. When that exorbitant privilege evaporates, reality rushes back in. As the dollar's share of global reserves drops toward 40% or 35%, its value relative to other currencies and real assets will decline. The math suggests that the cost of imported goods could rise by 20% to 30% over the next decade. This is not the temporary inflation you see on the news. This is structural repricing. A household that is used to cheap energy and affordable consumer goods will suddenly find that their purchasing power has been permanently severed. The United States will not become a third world country. Instead, it will become something arguably more painful for a superpower psyche. It will become normal. The US will be a large, wealthy nation, but it will be just one player in a multipolar pool, sitting alongside the Eurozone and the BRICS bloc. The dollar will still exist, but it will no longer be the king. It will just be another currency in the basket. In this transition, there are clear winners and losers. The primary strategic winner is China. Beijing does not need to defeat the US military in the Pacific. They simply need to wait for the US financial system to collapse under the weight of its own weaponized debt by building the lifeboats, KIPs, and gold reserves. While the US drills holes in the ship, China wins by attrition. The asset class winner is gold. As trust in fiat currencies, both the dollar and the euro, erodes due to political weaponization, central banks and savvy investors are fleeing to the only asset that is not someone else's liability. The record buying we are seeing now is just the early tremor of the shift. Decentralized systems also win. Bitcoin and crypto answer that operate outside the SWIFT and correspondent banking lattice gain value every time a government freezes a bank account. They are the technological answer to political overreach. The losers are the American middle class, specifically those who hold their life savings in cash or long-term U.S. government bonds. If you are holding U.S. treasuries yielding 4%, but the structural devaluation of the currency is running at 7% due to the loss of reserve status, you are losing money every single day. You are experiencing a negative real yield. The weaponization of SWIFT has ensured that the U.S. government can no longer export its inflation to you, the foreigner. It must now export it to you, the domestic voter. The standard of living you grew up with was subsidized by a global monetary monopoly that your government just voluntarily dismantled. The cycle is ruthless. It rewards those who prepare for the shift and punishes those who cling to the old world. And the most dangerous part, it's already happening. In the end, we must recognize the paradox of power. Financial sanctions are not a reusable instrument. They behave exactly like a honeybee's stinger. You can use them only once. The moment the stinger is deployed, it inflicts pain on the target. When London weaponized its financial system in 1914, it unwittingly started a 30-year countdown to its own obsolescence. The United States has now triggered the exact same mechanism. The hubris is identical, the pattern is identical, and the trajectory is set. The clock is ticking, and it is ticking faster than anyone in Washington cares to admit. 20 years from now, when the dust settles, future historians will look back at February 2022 with clarity. They will not see it as the moment Russia was isolated from the world. They will mark it as the specific moment the American century ended. The system wasn't conquered by an external enemy. It was dismantled from the inside by those who thought they owned it. The transition has begun. Welcome to the post-dollar world.